Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining today's discussion, the dollar and the global economy, how we got here and where we are going, with our special guest, Jeffrey Garten, Dean Emeritus of the Yale School of Management, and James Surowiecki, journalist, author, and lecturer in English at Yale as well. My name is Alex Baran-Priya. I am co-founder here at Ivy Exec, and I'm truly honored to have Ivy Exec host today's session alongside some great colleagues. Before we begin, just a few brief housekeeping items for you, our audience. We thank you for taking the time to join us from wherever you are in the world. First, all of our attendees are in listen-only mode. However, we really would like to encourage you to share your questions throughout the discussion between Professor Garten and James. We'll be spending about 40 minutes in discussion. There is a Q&A box that you will see in your control panel on Zoom. So please make sure to take advantage of this opportunity to submit your questions throughout. We'll have a formalized Q&A session during the last 15 minutes or so of our 1 hour together. Finally, we are recording our session today, as you may have noticed, so you can look forward to receiving a copy of this discussion in the coming days. And now I'll pass this over to Wendy Sung, Assistant Dean of the MBA for Executives program at the Yale School of Management, to introduce our guest today. Wendy?
Thank you so much, Alex, and thank you to those who are joining us today. Again, my name is Wendy Sung, and I serve as the Assistant Dean of the MBA for Executives program. Our MBA program is designed for mid-career working professionals who are interested in doing a deep dive into one of three areas of focus at the nexus of business and society. And those are asset management, healthcare, and sustainability. Our students complete the program over a 22-month period during which they attend class in person on the Yale University campus in New Haven, Connecticut, every other weekend on Friday and Saturday. They can also leverage our extended classroom technology to attend remotely when necessary. Our class weekends include optional social activities to get to know the university and Saturday workshops to enhance their professional development delivered by top members across the Yale faculty. The program begins with a 2-week residency period in July. Students study and travel internationally through a required global network week, and they start their second year with an additional week of residency. Throughout their 2 years, students participate in Colloquia, a speaker series curated by our faculty directors, where leaders in business and academia share their experience, expertise, and insight. Today, it's my pleasure to introduce Jeffrey Garten, Dean Emeritus and current professor at the Yale School of Management. Professor Garten teaches the Future of Global Finance course in the Asset Management area of focus for the MBA program, where he has won several teaching awards. He has held senior positions in the Nixon, Ford, Carter, and Clinton administrations, and was a managing director of Lehman Brothers and the Blackstone Group. His articles have appeared in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, Business Week, and the Harvard Business Review. And he is the author of 5 books on global economics and politics. Most recently, 3 Days at Camp David, How a Secret Meeting in 1971 Transformed the Global Economy. Professor Garten will be interviewed by James Surowiecki. James is a journalist, author, and lecturer in English at Yale University. James wrote the national bestseller, The Wisdom of Crowds, which was named a best book of the year by several publications. He was a columnist at The New Yorker for 17 years, writing the popular biweekly business column, The Financial Page. He also wrote the Bottom Line column for New York Magazine and was a business columnist for Slate. His writing has appeared in a wide range of publications, including, among others, the New York Times Magazine, the Wall Street Journal, Wired, and the New York Review of Books. James has also worked in documentary films and television. He was senior story producer and writer for the HBO series Vice News Tonight, and recently co-produced 2 movies on the history and meaning of college football for ESPN. Welcome, James and Professor Garten, and thank you for taking the time to speak to our audience. We hope this opportunity to hear from them will offer insight not only into Professor Garten's work, but also into how our faculty at Yale SOM regularly brings their research into the classroom. After their discussion, Professor Garten will take about 10 to 15 minutes to answer questions. So please feel free to type them into the Q&A feature in Zoom at any point, and we'll do our best to get to as many questions as we can. With that, I'll turn it over to James to begin the conversation. James.
Great. Thank you, Wendy. I appreciate it. And thanks everyone for coming. And thank you, Professor Garten, for sitting down here and talking about your great and really, really interesting book, 3 Days at Camp David. So I'm just going to talk, let me just talk for a couple minutes about the book and sort of set the stage, and then we'll jump in. So, the book is about one of the seminal moments in the history of the U.S. economy, and really about how the decision to sever the link between gold and the dollar, which was the linchpin of the global financial system in a lot of ways, in the post-war era, how that decision was made and what led up to it and what the consequences of it were. But I think one of the things that makes the book so fascinating is that it's about much more than just sort of monetary economics. In fact, what it really is a story about the end of an era. It's a story about decision-making, how decisions get made. It's sort of a really fascinating look at those 3 days in Camp David, and then how the Nixon administration managed the fallout from them. And I think it's also a book that in many ways feels quite timely, because it's a book about international policy and how you deal with conflicts among allies or among trading partners. And it's a book that feels, in that sense, very much of this time. So there's an enormous amount to talk about, and I think we'll start. Professor Garten, I just want to ask you, can you set the stage? Why was this such an important moment? And in a way, maybe that part of that question is also, why did you decide to write this book? I mean, why did you think this was a historical moment that was worth your time to dive into and really explore in detail?
Thanks, James. Well, why don't I start by explaining how I got to the subject?
Yes.
What really excited me about it. I had written several books about the global economy, but they were all about big themes. And when all is said and done, they were pretty much devoid of individuals and personalities, but dwelt more about the big forces that were shaping international trade or international finance, or the policies that countries were taking as a result of globalization. And but I always admired people who could take a very small story and then use it as a springboard to illustrate something much bigger. And the truth is, I didn't know much about this one meeting that I wrote about. I'd heard about it, and even though I was in the Nixon administration, it was after this had occurred. And I was very young, so I really wasn't conscious of it. And I found out that if you take an event and you really go very deep into it, it's much more than the event. It's kind of a picture of the times, and it's also a picture of what happened before and what happened afterwards. And so I was very fortunate, I would say, lucky. I picked a meeting in which there was still a number of people who were alive. It was far enough in the past, there weren't many people alive, but I managed to reach all of them. And so I tried to construct as realistic a story as I could. And I myself was quite taken by how relevant the story is to events today. I didn't start out thinking that. In fact, I didn't start out knowing much about the meeting, as I said, but I as I wrote, I was thinking about my students. I do use this case. I don't dwell on it too much, but in studying the future of global finance, there are lots of big decisions that are going to be made in the future. And I think how the decision, as you said, to delink the dollar from gold, how that was made, why it was made, has a lot of resonance for the future.
So let's talk a little bit about that. I mean, you mentioned sort of what came before. So in the wake of World War II, we have what's typically called the Bretton Woods sort of era, where basically the United States, I mean, as you put it in this sort of very nice sentence, the dollar was the centerpiece of the global monetary system. It was the sun around which the planets revolved. So the dollar is pegged to gold, which means that any country can basically come to the United States and give the US dollars, and the United States had to literally give them gold at the rate of $35 an ounce. Is that right?
Right, that's right.
It had to literally give them gold in exchange. And also the exchange rates among countries were as a result fixed. So we did not have the kind of floating exchange rates we have now. And this system, you could argue, worked very, very well for 25 years or maybe 20 years. And it was an era of enormous prosperity for the United States, the post-war era, and also an era in which West Germany and Western Europe generally and Japan make these incredible strides recovering from the devastation of World War II, et cetera. So what happened? Why did that system get to the point where the United States felt like it could no longer play the same role it had for the previous 25 years?
Well, the starting point is that after the Second World War, in fact, the US was the only country that was left standing. And we were obsessed with creating a new world order that would avoid the mistakes of the past. And the past was really the 1930s,
right,
the period before the war, where there was a gold standard, but it broke down. And as a result, there was an enormous amount of protectionism. Trade basically dried up. And there were a lot of people after the Second World War who were convinced that that protectionism led to a kind of nationalism or was wrapped up with nationalism. And this was not an insignificant fact in how the global order deteriorated into war. And so the US was determined to avoid those mistakes. And what they thought what was necessary was a steady expansion of trade. And in order to do that, they felt that currencies had to be fixed. You needed a certainty about currencies. And the only way they could figure out to do that was to say the dollar would be the global currency. Everybody wanted dollars. Everybody needed dollars right after the war. But to shore it up, to leave no doubt that the dollar would be solid, we said it would be backed by gold.
Because there was still this idea that gold was real somehow, or I don't know, had this kind of true universal value, essentially.
Right, and it's a bit irrational, but that feeling about gold went back thousands of years.
Right.
That gold was, because it was in limited supply, and because you could mold it into coins, it would not only be useful, but it would be protected against inflation. That was the key thing, that governments would inflate their currencies in order to print more money, but gold was solid. And as late as 1945, that was the reigning mythology.
Right.
So the dollar was backed by gold, and every president up through Nixon would start out their tenure by saying, the dollar is as good as gold. And, you know, even when people were doubtful that that would be the case as we started to lose gold, because right after the war, we had 2/3 of the world's gold. Nobody denied that we could exchange dollars into gold at the rate we said. But as the years went on, gold started to drain out of the US. And one reason was that countries, governments were starting to exchange their currencies for gold.
Right.
They didn't need so many dollars. As Japan and Germany recovered, they could begin to use their own currencies. And so
as you said, one of the things you mentioned in this is just as a side note that I thought was that France would sometimes just ask for gold kind of to maybe just be obstreperous, basically. And so France routinely asked for gold more often than other countries did.
Well, because France, even, it hasn't changed so much. France didn't like the US being at the center of the world. And
Right.
they kept, whenever they had a chance, they would exchange, their currency, which was French francs at the time, for gold.
And so the US is losing gold and gets to a point where it actually literally doesn't have enough money. It doesn't have enough gold to cover its
by the time,
obligations. Right?
by the time of the Nixon administration, we only had 10% of the gold that we needed. Right. So really the emperor had no clothes.
Right.
And my story is not only how we lost that gold, which in many cases was a result of the success of American policy, that we basically helped Japan and Europe recover to the extent that they were very competitive with us. And they didn't need our help. And the threat that they would come in and ask for gold was the threat that they would basically cause the US to declare a kind of bankruptcy.
Right.
So what I wrote about was the Nixon administration sitting around a table trying to figure out what to do, because this was a monumental problem in that this was the singular commitment that we had made to everybody in the world. We knew we had to break the commitment, but we didn't want to do it in such a way that everything else we were committed to looked very weak.
And sorry, go ahead.
No, and so what I wrote about was how we delinked the dollar to gold and basically changed the entire global monetary system, how that decision was made, how foreign countries reacted, how we negotiated a new monetary order in which the dollar wasn't backed by gold, and how it actually became very successful, far more than anybody could have envisioned at the time.
So one of the reasons why the United States ends up doing it is not just that they don't have enough gold, but also there's all these other problems, right? We have inflation, the dollar is overvalued relative to other currencies, which hurts our trade balance. The balance of payments is negative, all this other kind of stuff. I mean, John Connolly, who was Secretary of the Treasury at the time, when he's talking about it after the announcement is made, basically talks about all the problems that beset the country domestically and foreign. So all these things are going wrong and or problems that the Nixon administration is trying to deal with. And can you talk us through a little bit about how the decision got made? I mean, so that's a lot of what your book is about, how they decided to do what they were going to do. What were the issues they were wrestling with? They did it basically unilaterally. I mean, they did it and then basically told the other countries that they were doing it, I guess. Can you just talk us through a little bit about, how did they decide to do it? And how did the decision process work?
Well, sometimes I think in any organization, this happened to be the US government, but it could have been IBM. There's a really big problem.
Right.
And it's so big and all the choices seem bad. And as a result, you just postpone the decision. You study it to death. You try to think through all the contingencies and the collateral damage. You have an optimistic option. How can this work? But you don't quite believe it because you're basically leaving something you're leaving a world for an unknown world.
Right.
And all of these factors entered into the Nixon administration's decisions. They had no choice but to delink the dollar for gold because they didn't have the gold. It was real simple. And in some ways, that decision might have been made 5 years earlier because there had been a gold drain. But they kept kicking the can down the road because they were afraid this would be an enormous humiliation for the US. And finally, after all the studies and after thinking through every conceivable option, they go to Camp David for a weekend and they decide they have to move. And ironically, the decision that they made was less that they had to do it because that was sort of, they had no choice, but how they would present it. And I think that's another kind of parallel for organizations is when push comes to shove, you have to make an announcement.
Yes.
And the announcement becomes the decision. And in many ways, what follows hasn't been thought through very much. And that was the case here. They were going to delink the dollar from gold, but they didn't really know what would happen afterwards because this symbolized the end of the post-war era. In a way, it symbolized a draining of American assets and the rise of other countries. And so that whole weekend was spent, how do we describe this to the world in the most positive terms? And that's what they did. And they basically said that, we should have much more flexibility of exchange rates. The dollar should be worth less in terms of gold and we would make the adjustment that way, but we would fix the currencies again. And once they said that, in fact, the currencies just started to float and they could never get them back together. And they never anticipated that. They were always wondering what would be the new currency relationships. But the forces of the world economy took over. OPEC increased the price of oil, and that sent shockwaves through the system. And so we never again had currencies backed by anything except the words of governments. It's called fiat currencies. That's the system we have today. And so when people think, how did we get to these floating exchange rates? It all stemmed from this one meeting, and ironically, it stemmed from something that was unforeseen, which again is, I think, very reflective. Big decisions often are made, and you make them because you have to, but you don't really you can't envision what's around the corner.
So let me ask you about, I want to build on that a little bit and look at the decision-making process. But before I do that, I want to go back to something you said, which was, I wrote a piece for the New Yorker a long time ago about procrastination. That was probably one of the most popular pieces I ever wrote, I think, because so many people sort of identified with it. And that idea of sort of kicking the can down the road and kind of trying to, I don't know, maybe hoping something good was going to come along or whatever it was, is sort of interesting in this particular case, because you write that Nixon himself thought when he took office that gold was an anachronism and that the monetary system needed to be rebuilt. I mean, he didn't care that much about the monetary system, but he thought of gold as an anachronism. And there were all these issues, as you said, with it. And you also say that most people were going to support closing the gold window, that it was actually going to be something that was popular with voters, it seemed like. And yet it took them a long time to do it, or it took them years to do it. And it really took a crisis to drive them to it. And they were very worried about doing it. I mean, even you say that, even toward the end of the Camp David meeting, Arthur Burns, the Federal Reserve Chairman, was still hoping that maybe they wouldn't close it. So, what was it about the symbolic nature of it and the symbolic nature of devaluing the dollar that weighed so much? Why was it so hard for them to do this thing that they probably knew they needed to do?
Well, you have to realize that this took place about 25 years after the end of the war. And the United States had what was called a Marshall Plan psychology. Stemming from the end of the war, we felt so powerful and so immune from what was going on outside the US, except for the communist threat. But from an economic standpoint, we felt we could do anything. And it was 25 years after the war, it became clear that the situation had changed radically.
Right.
that we had a lot of domestic problems that had been swept under the rug. And one of them just being that for the first time, our workers were being put out of work by foreign competition. It never occurred to us that that would be the case. We had all the technology, we had all the industry, but lo and behold, we had spent so much time helping Japan and Germany to recover, and they did, and they recovered much faster than we thought. And so one of the reasons that there was this procrastination was, and one of the people around the table said this, we've got to forget the Marshall Plan. It was a long time ago. It was totally different circumstances. And we have to take care of ourselves. But we have to do it in such a way that we're not turning our back on the world and that everybody else still agrees that we are the leader. And that was sort of the big political conundrum, is how, in a sense, do we retreat? How do we become a little bit more of a normal country? How do we demand that others do a lot more for the world and take some of the burden off us without basically saying we're quitting and going home?
I mean, if you think about that metaphor you had about the dollar being the sun around which the planets revolved, it's almost like the shift is to the US being another planet. Now, still the biggest planet and arguably the most important planet, but sort of first among equals rather than being kind of the boss of the system or the linchpin of the system.
And that same debate is going on as we speak.
Yeah.
Where we want the Europeans to take more responsibility. In fact, some of the very same debates that the Europeans should pay more for defense and we should pay less relatively.
Yeah.
That the burden of foreign assistance shouldn't be so much on us, and that the Europeans and the Japanese should share that. Yeah. And that debate is going on when we talk about China today. If we're going to put pressure on China to obey, the global rules, it shouldn't just be us putting that pressure on. It should also, our allies should do that. So in a sense, all the things that President Biden is saying, those were the same arguments. The only difference was they were brand new then. And so from a psychological standpoint, it was very important that we don't look, that in making this adjustment, we don't look weak. And the symbol of the whole thing was the dollar. Right. Because as long as we had this link to gold, we were basically holding up the entire global system. And it was too much for us. We just weren't that economically, we weren't that strong. But the dollar then, and I would say now too, had a symbol. It symbolized something much more than just finance. It symbolized a kind of outsized power, a kind of strength that almost no country in history had had. And when you said this very well at the beginning, going from one era to another is very, very difficult. And as I wrote this book, I was thinking, I think we're going through this today. We are moving from one era to another. They couldn't, in 1971, actually define what this new era would be. They never, ever envisioned the rise of China as it has happened.
Yeah. Even though Nixon was the one who sort of opened the West.
Exactly, but that, they were, that would have been science fiction to them.
Yeah.
And so I, as I was finishing the book, I was trying to think, and I pose this question to my class all the time. If you had to think of what the new economic order might look like, really stretch your imagination. You couldn't possibly be right.
Right. But
what would you think about? And, certainly cryptocurrencies and digital currencies of central banks are going to be part of this new order. We don't know exactly in what proportion and with what effects. But I try to envision people sitting around the table now and making really big decisions based on the notion that we have got to plan for something new, even if don't know what the full implications are.
So I want to ask a little bit about return to this at the end, about kind of the lessons we might take away from that, or maybe the kind of not even the parallels. What might we learn about how we could do better now, or not better, make decisions now? But I want to talk about two things before we go to the Q&A. In addition to that, the first is the decision-making process itself, because that I think is relevant, not just kind of in a historical sense, but also very much relevant, as we mentioned earlier, kind of in an organizational sense. So Nixon brings everyone to Camp David, this very isolated, very comfortable place. One of the things I liked in the book is your discussion of the physical place that it was kind of an ideal setting for sort of free-flowing discussions. And there's this funny line, I can't remember who said it, but somebody says, it was a place where everyone was treated like an admiral, which actually made everyone feel like they were important, and therefore, they could participate as equals. What do you think about how do you think about the process by which these 3 days worked in terms of the way the decisions got made? Were there good things? I mean, was it a model for good decision making? I mean, what do you think in retrospect?
Well, I'd emphasize a few points. One is, it was a really talented group of people that surrounded Nixon.
Yeah.
I think, I've gotten lots and lots of comments about the book. And one that is, one that comes up all the time is that people forgot that the Nixon administration actually was filled with talent before Watergate.
Because we associate them with water. We just associate them with the crooks of
Watergate and crumbling. But
yeah,
the first 4 years, 5 years maybe, was the people that he had around him were not only really smart and really experienced, but it was kind of a level of dedication to public service that we would love to have today. I mean, I'm not going to go through the names now, but they were really terrific. And maybe one name that everybody would know is Paul Volcker, who was just a young undersecretary of the Treasury there, but already a star.
And he's at Camp David because he's the big monetary.
He knows the plumbing. He knows the plumbing of the system. Right. All the others just really had the big picture. I mean, of course, they had staffs, but there was no staff at Camp David. They were just.
And you mentioned that as something else that was actually paradoxically you thought was good for the discussions, that there weren't a lot of staff people scurrying around.
Well, because it meant that the people who were there didn't have to take bureaucratic positions.
Right.
They didn't have to defend their departments. They were brought there as individuals who, in their own right, were very talented and very experienced. So I thought that was really good. The other thing that was really clear to me was, when you're facing a really big, complex decision, you can't hammer it out by a committee, even if they're very good. They're very good because it's just too hard to bring it to a decision. And so Nixon and his Secretary of the Treasury, who was John Connally, and George Shultz, who people might remember, who at the time was the head of Office of Management and Budget. The three of them really decided on the outlines of what was going to be decided. And they used the others to kind of smooth the edges, and to make sure everybody was on board. But it strikes me that really big, complex decisions, that a few people have to make them. They may have to test them against others, but you can't actually make that decision if you have too many people. And so this, I think, in some cases was a model. The other thing is they recognized that they couldn't see too far into the future.
Yeah.
I think if I could have been knowing what I know now, if I were brought into that meeting and someone said, give me one piece of advice. Of course, that would never happen, but if it did, I would say, it's not going to work out the way you want. So the key thing is, how are you going to be resilient when the ball bounces a different way? Who is in charge of kind of looking ahead and constantly saying, wait a minute, this isn't going exactly as we want. So rather than just be surprised, you are more prepared than you were.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
No, I'm saying that's much easier said than done, of course. But I think the one thing that was not here was a anticipation that something was going to happen that they could not have foreseen.
I mean, one of the things I was struck by, though, in the post, sort of in the comments, like in the press conference after it was announced and the rest, was it was interesting to me that they were, or at least many of the people that spoke who were from the administration, were more comfortable with saying, we don't really know exactly how this is going to play out than I might have thought. Because Nixon is in the speech, and that's sort of where I wanted to shift and talk a little bit about the presentation, as you said, is another aspect of this. He presented as this which it was a big, bold move, blah, blah, blah. But it was sort of interesting that Connolly's like, well, we'll see. Well, basically, we'll see what happens. They were confident that it was the right decision, but I like that. I thought that was interesting. But let's shift a little bit, and we don't have that much time left, and talk a little bit about the way what the final policy was and the way it was presented. So one of the things that was interesting about the policy was, even though the centerpiece of it was this delinking of the dollar from gold, it's coupled with all this other stuff. So there are wage and price controls, which is actually a huge deal if you think about the U.S. economy. There's investment tax credits. There's a surcharge on foreign imports and the like. And then Nixon gives this speech in sort of Nixon fashion, a big kind of bold speech, the kind of thing he liked to do. Although you do this really nice job of reading it and say he sort of didn't really deliver it that well. But how did he present it in a way that was sort of designed to avoid the things he feared? I mean, how did he go out and try to sell this to the American public and I guess maybe to the global markets as well?
Well, he did it two ways. One is he basically said to Americans, we have done a fantastic job of rebuilding the world since the war. And now it's time to look after ourselves. And those countries that we built up now have to open their markets to us the way we did to them. And they have to assume much more responsibility for the cost of NATO. And they have to stop cheating by subsidizing their exports to us. The dollar is overvalued, not because of anything we did, but because they refused to strengthen their currencies when they should have. Now, the fact is they couldn't because of the rules.
Because the system, right?
But the Americans didn't know that.
Right.
But at the very same time, he sent Paul Volcker around the world, and then John Connolly, the Treasury Secretary. Literally, the midnight after he gave the speech, the midnight of the day he gave the speech, to tell the other countries, look, we know this is a real shock to you. We don't want it to be. Let's take a couple of months and negotiate a new order. And so he managed to do both. Talk to the American people in language they understood, but he flooded the foreign central banks and the finance ministries and the foreign ministries saying, we don't want any sharp change here. The things we want, you want, which is this new kind of stable order. And let's figure out how to do that. So it was quite masterful in terms of domestic and foreign diplomacy. The one thing he had was a great sense of that kind of strategy. So that's how he did it.
And one of the things he did in the speech was he sort of framed what they were doing as defending the dollar against international speculators, and sort of made this. And I mean, they originally had used the phrase money changers, but I think Arthur Burns convinced them to take the money changers out. But that idea of, again, kind of framing this, because he was obsessed, he was worried that devaluation was going to feel like failure or humiliation, right? And so he was able to reframe it to make it seem like we are taking a kind of strong step here.
Yeah, and let's remember one other thing that I should have mentioned this before. The US economy at the time was not doing so well. And there was a fear, as today, that inflation was really going to take off.
Yeah.
I think inflation was only about 5%, but it was higher than it had been. And there was a lot of speculation that it was going to go higher. And so he had to demonstrate to the United States, that his constituents, that he was a strong leader. He was taking both the foreign and the domestic situation in hand. And that's why he implemented wage and price controls at the same time. Again, I mean, there are some people beginning to talk about that now. The wage and price control, basically, they froze the entire economy.
And everyone in the administration thought it was a bad idea, but they
all knew it. They all
except for
knew it
Arthur
was going to
Burns,
blow up. Right. They knew it was going to blow up. They just didn't know how. And in the event, it took 3 years to blow up, by which time he had an enormously successful election. And I guess this is another sort of lesson here. You make a bad decision and stick with it, one day you pay.
Right.
You may not pay right away. And in fact, it may help at the beginning. But if you really haven't thought through the consequences, so they had wage and price controls, and when they removed them, prices just shot up, and we had inflation for the next several years. 12%, 14%, 16%.
Huge inflation, yeah, until '82, yeah. Okay, so we've got a couple minutes, then we'll take some questions. We've sort of talked some about the lessons for today. One thing I wanted to ask you about this was something you mentioned when we talked the other day, which was that at the end of your book, you're actually quite complimentary of the decision in the end. You think, while the wage and price control stuff was a mistake, that in general, what they arrived at was a good decision, and they did a good job of it. But one of the questions I had was, do you think it's harder for policymakers to get away with things? Get away may be the right word, but to implement things like this today, because there's just so much more analysis, there's so much more coverage, there's so much more, I don't know whether it's knowledge or not out there. I mean, it seems like in 1971, not that many people knew that much about the monetary system, other than these very few number of experts. I mean, is it just harder to do policy today than it was in 1971?
Well, I think it's a very interesting question. I concluded that these were really talented, experienced, and public-spirited people who did the best they could with the information they had.
Right.
It wasn't that it was a perfect decision. It was that it was the best they could do. And, over time, it emerged that the US remained at the center of the global system. The dollar remained at the center. In fact, strangely enough, the dollar became even stronger. And if you looked at the dollar in various countries' reserves, how much of international trade was taking place in dollars, how much international borrowing was taking place in dollars. So they came out okay. And, eventually the US economy entered a long boom phase. So, I think it was the best they could have done. But in terms of today, I think that people in public policy at the high levels have a much, much tougher job. And one reason is I don't think that below the top, they're getting the talent
Oh, that's
that
interesting.
went into public service in the 60s, in the 70s. I think because government's gotten sort of a bad name, and also because, in the 60s and 70s, there was no, Wall Street was not
Right.
the bonanza it was today. There was no Silicon Valley. And so there wasn't the distraction of great wealth outside of, for talented people.
I mean, one
But
of the
I
things
also think that the political system has become so polarized that as soon as somebody does something, there is an immediate challenge. And oftentimes the challenge is by people with no knowledge at all, but simply an ideology.
Right.
And then there's the media. We didn't have 24-hour media. We didn't have cable channels. We obviously didn't have the internet, and the chorus of complaint and criticism now, instantaneous.
Yes.
There was nothing like that there. So I have a feeling that any kind of decision like that is very, very hard to do. And maybe the great analogy would be the decisions about
Yeah, no,
COVID.
I mean, that's what I was thinking about. Yeah.
Second guessed by the second.
Yeah.
By the second.
Yeah.
And it's really hard to operate in that environment.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking about that in terms of kind of that idea of like uncertainty, or the fact that if you make wrong predictions, you are immediately seen as, oh well, you then obviously nothing. It's like predicting the future is hard, like Yogi Berra said, what predictions are hard, especially when it comes to the future. But it does seem like a much tougher environment, I think, in that sense.
Yeah, it's very tough. It's extremely tough, and I don't know the answer.
Yeah. So along those lines, we'll take some questions now. I'll just pass them along. But one of them has to do, speaking of predictions, with the future of the dollar, which let's not ask you to weigh in on exactly what you think is going to happen, but how do you think of the role of the dollar and of sort of state currencies generally in the current global system? I mean, it is in a sense the product of the meeting you talk about and the decision, but how do you think of it and what its role is going to be going forward?
Well, I'll tell you what I don't worry about. I don't think that other currencies are going to challenge the dollar in any meaningful way. So I don't believe, for example, the Chinese currency, the RMB, will challenge the dollar for supremacy, not in our lifetime. Or maybe that's too strong. Certainly not in the next couple of decades.
Sure.
And certainly the euro won't. And there's no other currency on the horizon that would qualify that way. I don't think that the act of digitalizing currencies is going to change the relative power of those currencies, because ultimately, whether you're holding a dollar or whether it's something on your computer, ultimately it's got to be backed by the strength of the economy. And so people say, well, China is way ahead of us in digital currencies, but still one day you have to get your money out of China, and you're going to look at the rule of law, and you're going to look at all the institutions, and you make your judgment accordingly. So I don't think that's really I don't think that's a big threat. Where I think the threat comes is in the policies we ourselves follow, and we Americans follow. The closer we come to defaulting on our debt, the more we seem to denigrate the Federal Reserve, or the temptation to take away Federal Reserve independence. If we stuff the Fed board with ideologues, as looked like it might be the case in the Trump era. These kinds of decisions will have an enormous impact. If we don't have honest elections, I mean, if we don't have elections that are not contested, that really affects others' views of our rule of law. And so I think the dollar has stayed so strong and so central because of the institutions that the US has, whether it's the Fed, whether it's the SEC, whether it's the rule of law, whether it's the orderly transfer of power. All of this is really reflected in the confidence that people have in the dollar. And we are perilously close to undermining that confidence. And if that happens, I just think all bets are off.
So that's actually a good pivot into the question about, we talk about 71 as kind of the end of an era, which it plainly was. And then the question of, are we at the end of another era, or where are we? In the sense that, if you think about the Trump administration, one of the things it did do certainly in terms of our international relations was Trump adopted a much more aggressive tack toward our trading partners, not just China, but also Canada and Mexico and the sheer amount of tariffs we put on Western Europe and the like. And then obviously more generally, his kind of somewhat isolationist view, or whatever you want to call it. So how do you think about the place we're in globally right now, and what the task that Joe Biden has before him when it comes to that? I mean, in a way, we've paid very little attention to this because of COVID, obviously, and our domestic issues, but where are we in a kind of global, in terms of the global trading order, the global economic order right now?
Well, I think we're at a major inflection point, and it's not at all clear in which direction we're going to go. As you said, I think COVID has put a blanket over the whole thing, and maybe we're not going to be in a position to think this through while COVID exists. But let's just say it's a year or two from now, and we're in a much better situation in terms of the virus. All of those things that Trump did caused enormous questions around the world about whether we not only can be a leader, but whether we want to be. And somehow that has to be resolved, because we have. Of course, I would hope that we kind of, like Nixon, we make a big adjustment, but I think we have a lot to offer the world that no one else does. And so the nature of that leadership has to be defined much better. Right now, it's very ambiguous because I think that President Biden hasn't really changed that much economically.
Yeah, it's not.
He's kept all the tariffs. He hasn't shown one iota of interest in expanding trade. In fact, it's the opposite. And so we're really at a crossroads. I do think the biggest thing, though, that overshadows, and this, Nixon didn't have this. I mean, even with Watergate, which came after what I wrote about, and I lived through that, I don't remember doubts about the American democracy. It was about how we're going to clean some of this stuff up.
Yeah.
What kind of new laws we would. Nobody was doubting that. Nobody was raising questions. Do we have a vibrant democracy? In fact, the fact that we were able to address Watergate was, I think, a vindication of our system. Today, I just don't know. I don't want to be too pessimistic, but I think that the political polarization and the kind of radicalization of both parties, we are in a bad spot.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about Watergate, I mean, one of the striking things in retrospect is that so many Republicans essentially told Nixon he had to go. So it was not a case where, that was ended up being a purely partisan
Not at all.
vote or anything. And that obviously is radically different from what we saw both with Trump's impeachment trials and then also with the certification of the 2020 election, basically.
Right.
Where it's much
But
more-
ultimately, this infects the economic system.
Yeah.
Because the decisions that have to be made, if they become overly political, then they don't take root. And I think one kind of interesting thing about the 1971 decision that I wrote about is that there may have been differences about whether we should have fixed exchange rates or flexible exchange rates. And there may have been differences about whether we should have wage and price controls or not. But if you really go into the discussions, you see, it was never, I don't think anyone raised the question about who's going to vote for this or who's going to vote for that. These were kind of technocratic decisions that people were making. And when they actually made it, they got huge congressional support. You would have thought, if some of those decisions of that kind were made today, we'd have a revolution. But really, they had almost unanimous congressional support. And I don't want this to come out the wrong way. 99% of those people in Congress had no idea what this was about.
Right.
But they took it for granted that it was thought through and that the national interest was evaluated. And they didn't have standing to say anything major. A few did, but those who did agreed with the administration.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that also is sort of striking about that moment, about 71, is that even as it's about the United States kind of, essentially removing itself from being the centerpiece of the system, it also was in some ways a kind of moving in the direction of more globalization and in the direction of more trade, not less, in the direction of kind of a freer system, a freer sort of global economic trade system, which Nixon, for instance, was in favor of. And it does feel like at the moment, the protectionism and this idea sort of closing in is very powerful here in the US, I think, right now.
Actually, you raise a really good point. Some people said in changing the system, we were looking at what's best for ourselves and kind of taking a very nationalist approach, overly nationalist approach. But every person around that table went to great lengths to say, we want to have more trade, we want to have more investment, we believe in a more open global system.
Yeah.
And that the reason we're doing this, we're making this adjustment, is if we don't, we're going to have massive protectionism. And so in a way, this was a step towards a more open global economy, even though you could have construed it differently.
Yeah. All right. We are out of time, so Alex is going to come back, but Professor Garten, thank you very much. This was really interesting.
Thank you.
And would be happy to spend another hour talking about it. So this is just, thanks. This is great.
Thank you very much.
I echo. I think we could have gone at least another hour, Professor Garten and James, with the two of you. The discussion was very lovely, and it's very clear to me, being one of many flies on the wall, hearing your discussion, that the linkage between the dollar and the global economy is a powerful one. That's a clear take-home message for me, and it spans several decades and very much continues to reverberate with where we are today in the world. And so I do speak on behalf of the entire audience, Professor Garten and James, to say how appreciative we are of your time and allowing us the space to hear such a wonderful, thoughtful discussion between the two of you. And I'd like to thank the audience for taking the time to join us today. You'll be receiving a recording in the days ahead, and we certainly look forward to seeing you at our next discussion. Thank you, everyone. Have a good rest of the day.
Thanks. Good to see you, Jeff. Take care. Thanks, Alex. Thanks. Bye-bye.